Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are. A warm welcome to this webinar of the Cyber Policy Center at Stanford University. We still have some people trickling in, but I think we can well use this hour to the fullest, so I'm excited to get started. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Marietje Schaake. I serve as the International Policy Director at the Cyber Policy Center and also as an International Policy Fellow at Stanford's Institute for Human-Centered Artificial Intelligence. And even though there's so much going on in the world, I'm very excited to focus on Web3 for this session, even though it's hard to keep our eyes off the news and the disturbing developments between Russia vis-a-vis Ukraine. I think we can dive into a discussion and a scoping of a subject that is really the focus of a lot of hope and a lot of hype, and that is Web3. I've read articles by experts that completely dismiss it as a naive and unfeasible idea. But we've also seen how investors are willing to invest billions into the quote unquote next internet. And a lot of the sound bites and anticipations around Web3 really remind me of the promise of the open internet of a couple of decades ago. And with the current design and governance of the internet so deeply commercialized and far removed from that initial dream of connecting the world and unlocking information and knowledge for all, the aspiration of building something better and afresh is definitely appealing and urgent. But the question is how to avoid a new round of big tech, winners take all kind of capture and a deepening of intransparent power redistribution. Can trust be tech-induced, or are democratic laws and policies still needed to allow for independent insight and oversight? Now, I'm really happy and grateful with the excellent set of speakers that are willing to help us understand what Web3 means to them, what the promises may look like, but also specifically which policy implications we can anticipate. The next hour is going to go as follows. There will be brief introductions from each of the speakers. They'll briefly be able to respond to each other with some follow-ups, but then I'll be very excited to opening it up to you and your questions. And please know that this session will be recorded for later viewing. So if you want to share it with colleagues or friends later, that is all possible. We will be hearing first from Michelle Fink, who is a professor of law and artificial intelligence at the University of Tübingen, that's in Germany. She's an affiliated fellow at the Max Planck Institute for Innovation and Competition in Munich and the Center for Blockchain Technologies at University College London, and a visiting professor at LUISS University in Rome. That's quite a list. She previously worked at the University of Oxford, London School of Economics, and her work looks at blockchain technologies and AI through the lens of law, governance, and particularly data protection. We'll then go to Cory Doctorow, who I think of as a one-man orchestra on everything digital rights, copyright, interoperability, and antitrust. He's a science fiction writer and an activist, known for his blogs and prolific Twitter feeds. And I don't know how he does it, but he writes multiple books a year and recently added a fascinating essay on the topic of today called "The Inevitability of Trusted Third Parties, the Search for a Crypto Use Case Continues." So I'm sure we'll hear some interesting comments from him today as well. And then last but not least, Tamika Tillemann, about whom I often forget how we initially got to know each other, because since I was a fellow a long time ago in his respected late grandfather's office on Capitol Hill, Tom Lantos, our work has intersected on many occasions, and that has always been wonderful. Tamika has worked for then Senator Biden, Secretary Clinton, the New America Foundation, and Andreessen Horowitz. And he's currently a partner and global chief policy officer at KRH Partners, which is a new crypto venture fund led by former Andreessen Horowitz general partner Katie Haun, where he builds public policy architecture to support the next generation of the internet. So these are, I think, the best possible people we could have to reflect and kick us off today. Michelle, could you take the floor and share your introduction? Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for this very kind introduction. It's a real pleasure to be with all of you tonight. So let me start by saying a few words about what I think Web3 actually is, and particularly what its core innovations might be, and then B, introduce some of the regulatory implications that those innovations could come to have. So what is Web3? I think there's no denying that this is a buzzword that is being used by different people, sometimes referring to different things. I think it's fair to say that at the very least, the notion of Web3 alludes to the fact that we're entering a new phase of the web after Web 1 and Web 3. Now, that in itself is not very interesting to the extent that it is obvious that our online world and presence will continue to evolve just as it has over the past few years and decades. I think the more interesting question to ask is what form those changes will actually take. And although I think that there's still lots of terminological uncertainty around what Web3 actually is, I think we can distill a few core features. So Web 1 was essentially the phase of the internet where you could read online content. Web 2 then changed this as we saw an emergence of platform-mediated web, where you could still read content, but also create and publish your own. And I think what Web3 really promises to do is add two core features of what we currently have, both of those features being enabled by blockchain technology. The first one is that you can now own, or as a law professor, I should really say own, digital assets, particularly what we think of today as fungible and non-fungible tokens. So fungible tokens being stuff like Bitcoin or stable coins or some of the many other coins that have emerged over the past years. And non-fungible tokens or NFTs, which today are really, I think, essentially digital art, but which I think would come to take on a much more granular and sophisticated functionality in the years and decades to come, as a result of which they will then also be used beyond the context in which we're seeing them today. And then the second core innovation that Web3 promises to bring about is decentralization. And I actually think that the second characteristic is the one that's most interesting from a regulatory perspective, or at least it is to me. And decentralization in Web3, I think, really refers to two different phenomena. The first one is that power and control over online networks will become more distributed to what we're seeing in platform-based models today. The second relates to the idea that the storage and governance of data will become equally distributed. And as a result of those two things, there would be no more central access points to online services and content that gatekeepers control, but rather the idea is that I myself can become a co-provider and co-creator of online services and content. Now, I think it's important to point out that there's no way of taking for granted whether this decentralization will actually materialize. I think there's some early signs that sort of indicate that the locus of centralization might simply change and shift to different actors, and some early signs that might indicate this is things such as the emergence of new centralized choke points and gatekeepers in Web3. So one indication of this is that people trading crypto assets mainly do so through centralized exchanges as opposed to decentralized exchanges. I think I recently read that 2 of those exchanges actually control almost a third of the validators on the Ethereum Beacon chain, the Ethereum Beacon chain being the sort of branch of Ethereum that will transition to proof of stake over the course of this year, which in turn predicts that we're going to see a lot of centralization around wealth in proof of stake systems. And then, of course, it's also no secret that many Web3 applications continue to use centralized parts of Web3, such as the fact that many of them rely on AWS, for instance, at least for now. So really, only the future will tell us whether those systems will really become more decentralized, or whether the locus of centralization will simply shift from one actor to another. Still, I think that either of those possible futures will have fascinating regulatory implications and policy implications that it is worthwhile thinking about. And I'll just mention three here by way of introduction, and then of course I'm looking forward to discussing many more of them with you in the course of this session. So I mainly look at those things from the perspective of European data law, which is really what my work focuses on. And I think three interesting dynamics we see here is first the fact that in Web3, the determination of the location of data and the jurisdiction over a network is much harder to determine in Web3 than it is in Web2. Yet that determination is important, for instance, for in countries that have data localization requirements. It is also important from the perspective of the General Data Protection Regulation here in the EU, which imposes strict conditions on when data can be exported outside of the EU. Then secondly, in Web3, it will be much more difficult to determine who is responsible to comply with the law in a system where many different parties shape and control the protocol and the data that is being used. So in Web3, you don't have a single party or single legal person that controls the data and the protocol. Yet most contemporary legal frameworks were really designed for worlds where there is one centralized legal person behind a platform or an app that is the addressee of legal obligations. In decentralized networks, this is much more complex. And we saw an interesting discussion of this in an opinion that was issued by the French Data Protection Authority a couple of years ago, in which it tried to assess the compatibility of blockchains with the GDPR. And the French DPA came to the conclusion that there's many different parties in blockchain networks that might be liable to comply with the GDPR. And this conclusion really is problematic to the extent that because of the way in which the technology works, many of the parties that are formerly legal addressees or addressees of legal obligations will be factually unable to comply with those legal obligations, which of course is not a desirable state of affairs. And then the third point that I'll mention very briefly is the fact that there are some legal obligations that it may simply be impossible to implement in Web3, even though it was possible to implement them in Web2. And I think the most often mentioned example, at least in EU law, is the so-called right to be forgotten that forms part of the General Data Protection Regulation and which requires that in some circumstances, personal data is erased. Yet, of course, one of blockchain's core value proposition is the immutability of data. So this is an incredibly difficult tension. So I think I'm going to stop here, and I'm very much looking forward to the rest of the event. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was very clear and concise and very helpful introduction. So I think it sets us off on a good overview of what we're basically talking about, but also how complex it can come when it comes to details. Corey, do you want to take it from there?
Sure. I think maybe I'm the most skeptical of blockchain on this panel. I don't know, maybe not, but I'm going to try and concisely deliver some of my objections to what has been called Web3 and blockchain and the decentralization movement and so on, and from the perspective of someone who's very interested in decentralization. I was the keynote speaker at the first 3 decentralized web conferences, and I am a great believer in restoring the internet to what it was before. In the words of Tom Eastman, it became 5 giant websites filled with screenshots of text from the other 4. And because I am so concerned about that and so adamant that that's the web we deserve, I find myself very concerned about Web3. So for starters, every Web3 discussion begins with something like a benediction that I think Michelle delivered very well, which is to note that nobody knows what Web3 means yet. And that's pretty true, right? That there's a lot of squishiness around the edges. And, that's not always the worst thing in the world. Words can mean lots of different things, and over optimizing on a single set of principles early on before we know how things are going to go can be a self-limiting move. But it strikes me as very concerning that the people making the largest bets on Web3 are also the people who are the ones promoting the idea that there is a thing called Web3, but they're not going to tell us what it is yet, and yet it has something to do with decentralization. And I find it hard to understand how firms whose limited partners expect 10 to 100x returns find themselves putting billions of dollars into a technology that they say will be decentralized unless they have some plan for extracting those kinds of returns on their capital. And those plans generally require that you be in the middle of a bunch of other people's transactions, right? That there be some kind of choke point at which rents can be collected. That is the historic bet of capital in tech and capital more generally. And in specific, I'm really concerned that the system design ethic that overwhelmingly imbues all of the Web3 projects that I look at is the idea that the way that you create sustainable democratic institutions is to devolve their governance to alienable tokens. So we've heard about fungible and non-fungible, but we haven't heard a lot about alienable versus non-alienable. The idea of an alienable token, a tradable token, a token that can appreciate in value, is fundamentally about mixing the provision of a public or cooperative good with speculation. That the reason that people buy into these projects is always going to be a mixture. Some of them are buying in because they want to build the thing, they want to buy the thing, they want to do the thing. And some of them are just betting that their tokens can be sold to someone else who wants to do the thing or buy the thing. The thing about alienable tokens versus inalienable tokens in the provision of public goods is that alienable tokens tend to end up, if the goods themselves are valuable, tend to end up in the hands of a small number of people because they have the capital to secure those tokens from the other parties. So think about the pre and post Thatcher provision of public housing in the United Kingdom, where pre Thatcher you had an inalienable right to live in a public flat, and those flats, when you no longer needed them, reverted to a pool of public housing. And Thatcher proposed that we could align the incentives of people who wanted to build flats and people who wanted to live in flats and increase the stock of housing supply and its quality with something called right to buy, which was like an airdrop for houses, where you got to wake up one morning and own your flat at significantly below the market rate. And that was significant because you could sell your flat at whatever the market rate was. And 40 years later, Britain is facing one of the worst housing crises of any country in the world because all of those flats ended up in the hands of speculators. Many of them are empty, but still valuable as safe deposit boxes in the sky because their beneficial owners aren't disclosed, and they're real estate investment trusts and other exotic instruments that are used by the worst people in the world to launder their money. The United Kingdom is ground zero for money laundering for the worst despots in the world. And London property is ground zero of the United Kingdom's money laundering problem. And we don't have public housing, and we don't have housing provision. And contrast that with other solutions to this, like in New York City, which is hardly a bastion of socialist values, where one of the most stable and effective and sought after and desirable forms of housing is the co-op building, where you buy a share, but you can only sell it back to the co-op. It has no speculative value. It is the right to live in a flat, and then the right to sell the flat back to the co-op so someone else can live in the flat. And that kind of system design actually does provide for social goods. The other thing that I want to point out, and Maricha alluded to it, is that a lot of the rhetoric of Web3, it elides some really important details and implies that they have a kind of crisp quantitative computational answer, even though they have irreducible social components to them. And in particular, I'm referring to the problem of oracles. The idea that for Web3 to work, for smart contracts to work, there needs to be some way for a computer to ask the world, for this distributed computer that we call the blockchain and its smart contracts, to ask the world, did a thing happen? Did so-and-so sell this to such and such? Did so-and-so fulfill a condition of a contract? Are the goods as described before they were delivered? And all of these require an oracle. They require a mechanism by which truth can be established within a computational model that itself has no contact with the real world. So if you have a an NFT, and it comes with a smart contract, and that smart contract says the party who sold the NFT or the party who created the NFT is entitled to a royalty every time it changes hands. The way it is in under European but not US law, if in certain art markets. The way that works as a piece of software is the smart contract has a program in it, and that program looks for events from exchanges called a sale. And when the sale is registered, the program takes a fraction of the sale, turns it into a royalty, and remits it to the wallet associated with that original creator. But the exchange has under no obligation to book the transaction as a sale. If they called it a sale _1, the smart contract would not interpret it as a sale. And in fact, you can't really build an effective system where every transfer is treated as a sale and generates a royalty, because in that world, if you went from one wallet to another, transferred it to yourself, that would show up as a sale. So there has to be this system where unless a transaction is identified in a certain way, it will not, the smart contract will not fire. And for there to be a mechanism by which you have actual contractual enforceable terms here, you need to have a non-blockchain, non-smart contract, actual contract backed by regulators and lawmakers who go around and say to exchanges, every time you register a sale, you have to fire a sale event and not a sale _1 event at the smart contract to ensure that the royalties are collected. Well, at that point, you don't need the smart contract, right? At that point, all the smart contract is a bunch of incredible computational complexity that produces an enormous amount of vulnerability that can be exploited as a security defect, as we've seen over and over again with existing smart contracts. Because the actual enforcement mechanism, the actual markup mechanism is taking place off-chain, outside of the hermetically sealed computational world. Not only that, and this is where I'll close, and maybe we can get into some other details later. Not only that, but the determinations that we ask oracles to make are not crisp. They are irreducibly fuzzy. So I'll give you an example of a public ledger that I really like. I actually helped write the paper that described it for Nature. It's called Certificate Transparency. And it's a public append-only ledger that's maintained on dozens of computers all around the world. Anyone can join it. It's not a blockchain, but it is a public append-only ledger. And you use it every day because every major browser, every time it receives a certificate, that is to say a thing that says the computer I'm connected to, this web host that I'm connected to is my bank or my government or my employer or my favorite news source, that certificate is signed and sent to your browser. Your browser produces what's called a hash of it and fires it off to one or more of these certificate transparency authorities that are all around the world that anyone can set up. And if you are Google and you are worried that one of the thousands of certificate issuing bodies that are trusted by your browser might issue a Google certificate that would enable spies or criminals or spyware vendors to snoop on traffic between Google and its users, you can monitor all of these certificate transparency servers. And you can tell within an hour if anyone who shouldn't have issued a Google certificate has issued that Google certificate. And you have proof, mathematical proof, because it's got their signing key that has signed the hash that has produced the certificate. It is irrefutable that that bad certificate has been created. This whole system was created by a Google cryptographer named Ben Laurie. He's a British cryptographer of great repute, wonderful chap. He and I co-wrote the paper. And as he suspected when he created this system, it only took a couple of months to catch people issuing bad Google certificates that could be used to spy on Google traffic. Specifically, VeriSign was issuing bad Google certificates because VeriSign used it as part of their unit tests whenever they stood up a new production suite. So the last thing they do when they made a new, when they stood up a new server is produce an illegal Google certificate just to make sure it worked, which they were then supposed to destroy, but which at least one of leaked out into the wild and was registered by one of these certificate transparency servers. So you may have noticed that VeriSign still exists, right? Even though we had irrefutable proof that the one thing they were never, ever supposed to do, ever, They did repeatedly. And here's the thing. If your analysis that goes into your system design starts with economics and facts and doesn't factor in power, like the fact that VeriSign was never going to go out of business just because it was caught cheating, it would just sort of mumble mouth an apology and promise to do better and cross its fingers and pinky swear, then your system will fall apart, because power is as important as facts. Power is as important as incentives. You know, the golden rule is them that has the gold makes the rule. And if you design a system where you set aside democratic checks and balances in favor of the idea that a contract can determine ground truth about the world and enforce itself, then you will produce a system where the powerful cheat with impunity and the powerless are left with the answer that we all hate the most, which is computer says no. And so that's my concern about Web3 as someone who wants decentralization.
Thank you, Corey. That was remarkable, and I think a really good kickoff for Tamika to bridge the question of how come, you know, billions are being poured in by the wealthiest venture capitalists, and how does that relate to the notion of a public interest decentralization, not only technologically but also in terms of questions of distribution of power that Corey ended on. Go for it.
Well, thank you very much, Marieke. It's a great pleasure to be here with you, and wonderful to hear thoughts from both Michelle and Corey. As we get into this, and Michelle and Corey both touched on this in their remarks, but I think it's really important to state it explicitly. It's critical to delineate the reason why we need a Web3. And the reason why we need a Web3 is because Web2 is profoundly broken. And unless we start with an examination of the really extensive issues that exist with Web2, it's tough to have, I think, a reasoned and thoughtful conversation about where we want to go with Web3. We are living in a world right now that has two dominant technology paradigms. If you are a human on planet Earth that wants to utilize technology, you really only have two options available to you in order to do that. The first is an authoritarian model that's emerging out of Beijing, in which personal information is used to manipulate behavior for political purposes. And then the second is a big tech model emerging out of Silicon Valley and Seattle, in which private personal information is consolidated and used to manipulate behavior for commercial purposes. In the long run, neither one of those paradigms is compatible with a healthy open society. So the point of departure for this conversation in some ways needs to be, what is our alternative going to look like? What do we want to see from technology? How do we want to utilize these tools in the context of open societies? And I think that Web3 provides some very intriguing, compelling answers as we start to answer those, as we start to address those questions. We don't have all the answers yet, and it's really critical to state that at the beginning of this conversation. This is a space that is evolving likely more rapidly than any major field of innovation in human history. And the one thing I can guarantee as this story unfolds is we should all prepare to be surprised. There are inevitably going to be some twists and turns along this path that we haven't anticipated. But it is nonetheless a really critical moment to start building a new framework for how we're going to utilize digital tools to accomplish the goals that we want to in the context of an open society. So let me, with that as backdrop, highlight 4 areas where we see some big opportunities, but also some important challenges emerging in Web3. The first is around digital identity. And critically, Web2 has provided a handful of organizations with de facto ownership of our digital identity. That's a real problem, and that problem will persist unless and until we can come up with a framework that enables individuals to have greater control over their information. Web3, in principle, can provide that framework. We're still a ways from where we need to be, and the data architecture that will be required to realize that vision in full has not yet fully matured. So it's very important to recognize that there's a lot of work that still needs to happen in this space. But the prospect of privacy-preserving, decentralized digital identity would be a watershed and help design the types of systems that we want to see in open, vibrant, democratic societies. The second point I think is worth focusing on is community. Web 2 takes a fascinating approach to data. Individualized, highly atomized data is the most valuable thing you can have in Web 2 because it enables you to shift behavior in ways that will sell more widgets or lead to a more docile populace. Web 3 takes a very different approach to community and to data. In Web 3, community, rather than highly atomized individual data, is the real cornerstone of success. If you're able to build dynamic, vibrant, successful communities, odds are you're going to have a dynamic, vibrant, successful Web3 platform. And that shift is very significant. And at a moment when many of our societies are struggling to create healthy communities, it provides a lot of promise. Now, again, we've seen digital tools used for good and bad, and we should not assume that just because these platforms can create healthy communities, they necessarily will. But the fact that you now have venture capital firms like ours examining the health and vitality of communities as one of the key metrics in determining where we're going to deploy capital is, for me, a very positive sign and something that we should all be encouraged by as we see the evolution of this space. Next is incentives. And incentives are, I think, going to be critical to getting this right. Corey alluded to this a little bit in his remarks. We need to design a better set of incentives that will encourage a better set of behaviors in the digital world. Web3 provides us, again, at least in principle, with an incredibly powerful new set of tools to do that. DAOs and NFTs are some of the basic building blocks, along with fungible tokens, that are being developed in this space. But we could, if we're thoughtful in how we pursue this, come away with a very compelling new set of tools that will enable us to encourage behavior that leads to positive outcomes for society and discourage behavior that has created a lot of problems in the context of a Web 2 world. And finally, ownership and governance. And these two are critical, and for the moment, they're closely intertwined. I don't know that we're going to want that to stay the case forever. All of us presumably see some value in living in a market economy, and market economies are very powerful engines for innovation. But many of us, certainly me, would have some real qualms about living in a market society. The way that governance works in Web3 platforms right now, they are community owned, which is incredibly powerful and a huge step forward from what we have in Web 2. They're also community governed, and that those that hold tokens are able to have a say in how platforms are going to be managed. But we need to watch to ensure that we don't end up with a Web3 oligarchy. And that's something that I and many others are sensitive to. We've seen pioneering approaches to this, and including in work that Katie Hahn, who's one of our colleagues at KRH, pursued at Andreessen Horowitz, where we have delegated governance rights to civil society organizations, universities, and other actors that don't have a profit stake in how platforms are going to be managed. We're going to need creative solutions like that in order to ensure that these platforms continue to mature in a healthy way. We need to get this right. We need an affirmative vision for how we want to utilize technology in an open society. And I think it's also critical to recognize that this is too important for government, the private sector, or civil society to do on their own. We all need to be working together if we want to reach the destination of a much healthier, more dynamic, digitally enabled society. If we are successful, we will be able to replenish the reservoir of trust that should irrigate everything we do. And frankly, it is a reservoir that has run dry in recent years. It's conversations like this that I hope are going to get us there. So with that, I will stop talking and hand things back to you, Marietje.
Thanks so much, Tamaika, and really thanks to all of you. I want to give you an opportunity to reflect on each other's comments, but what strikes me the most, and maybe you can factor that into your answers, is that each of you have clearly touched upon the impact on democratic governance. And so maybe we can dig a little bit deeper into that with questions like, who decides what's good? Who has a mandate? Where does independent oversight come from? Michelle pointed out to complications with notions of oversight and enforcement. Tamaika, you mentioned the aspiration of having a more democratic model, but I think it would be good to dig into more detail what the governance looks like. And Corey, you also placed some of the developments around Web3 or its mechanisms at odds with democratic governance. So maybe you can reflect on that. I'm happy to go in the order in which you spoke. So Michelle, Corey, Tamaika, and then I'll start looking at the questions that are coming in to the Q&A function to pick out a couple of those. Thanks.
Yeah, so I think this is one of the key questions that we have to ask when looking at those systems. And actually, your reflection just now sort of took me back to what Corey was saying in relation to this issue of bridging on-chain worlds and off-chain worlds, right? And I think that is also the case in relation to democratic governance and law in particular, right? And I think this really is one of the areas where we definitely don't have solutions yet, but I think it's also one of the areas that really make us question the added value of blockchains and whether, to what extent that added value still stands if this bridging needs to take place. So sort of this is a bit abstract to give a concrete example, right? I might have an NFT, sort of on-chain data reflects it's my NFT, and then someone comes to my house with a gun and says, well, just send this to my wallet, right? So I do this, and all the blockchain knows is that now this NFT is that person's NFT. Now, of course, democratic laws would never recognize this as a valid transaction of property, right? And I think it's sort of examples like that illustrate that there needs to be some sort of communication between the rules of the system and the rules that emerge from democratic governance. And I think this is something that much more thinking needs to go into. And, frankly, I think that thinking might lead to the conclusion that at least some, and I'm not saying all, but I think that at least some applications of the technology might just no longer have any value if that bridging takes place.
Thank you, Corey.
Yeah, so I'm a great fan of the idea of decentralized governance. I think that it's really important. In that paper you referenced, the one about the irreducible need for trusted third parties, I jokingly provided a little equation for thinking about the blockchain, which is that if the problem plus the blockchain equals the problem minus the blockchain, then the blockchain equals zero. In other words, if the blockchain doesn't make your problem, if you still have the same problem after you add blockchain to the problem, you didn't need the blockchain to solve your problem. And I think that that is the case with DAOs, at least to the extent that I've seen them in the wild so far. So the thing about a DAO is that almost everything that it can do that matters, with the exception of transferring funds with a multi-sig wallet, requires that the DAO tokens vote for a thing that a human goes off and does. And if the human doesn't go off and do the thing that the DAO tokens voted for, then the DAO is out of luck. And so you're trusting a human, right? You're trusting a person. And there are all kinds of cool things that I've seen DAOs doing. Like a bunch of them have picked up on the Pirate Party's excellent liquid democracy governance tool, which uses delegated voting. And they put it on the blockchain, where it became a lot more insecure because it had a bunch of smart contract stuff that was hard to audit, and also a lot more complicated and expensive to run, and still had the problem that at the end of the day, your liquid democracy instance that you have ported to smart contracts then issues a directive to a human who either does it or doesn't. And if they don't, then your only recourse is to have previous to this incorporated as like a cooperative or an LLC or a limited company that had bylaws, whose bylaws instructed this person to do what the governance tokens voted for, in which case you didn't need the DAO. You also didn't need the complex, less good version of liquid democracy. If you're going to trust someone to do the things that liquid democracy tells them to do, you can trust them to run the liquid democracy server. And if you can't trust them to do the things that liquid democracy tells them to, then you're out of luck. You don't have a DAO, you have a polling system. The actual autonomy that the A in DAO stands for, that doesn't actually happen. It doesn't, the will of the majority is actually the whim of the person who is at the pointy end of the spear of the vote. I also wanted to say that I think that if we accept that the problem with Web 2.0 is behavior modification through data acquisition, then it may make sense to think of Web3 as the answer. And I'm a privacy advocate, but I'm not a privacy advocate because I believe the evidence-free assertions of tech companies that they figured out how to use big data to make a mind control ray. I'll accept that they can do incredibly precise targeting, and that's very helpful to people who want to sell a refrigerator. It's a very hard problem in marketing since most of us buy one or fewer refrigerators in our lives. But the idea that like Mark Zuckerberg made a mind control ray to sell your nephew a fidget spinner, and then Robert Mercer stole it and made your uncle a QAnon, I think is something that gives Mark Zuckerberg far too much credit. He's not an evil genius. He's a sociopathic mediocrity, no different from anyone else who used their access to the capital markets to acquire every single one of their competitors or extinguish them, and then conspired with the competitors that they could neither acquire nor extinguish to rig prices and take control of markets. And if that's the problem, right? If the reason that these companies gather data is because they have monopolies, they can solve the coordination problem because there's only a couple of companies in each sector. They can stave off federal privacy law with a private right of action. And then they can gather this data that is actually quite low value and low quality, but they can gather it in such quantity that they can extract value from it. If data is the new oily rag and not the new oil, then reinforcing the hegemony of the wealthy gets us nowhere. And giving them credit for doing things that there's no evidence that they can do. People who are out there citing discredited, non-replicating psych research like big five personality types might as well be talking about horoscopes. And yet, the fact that they're out there claiming that that's how their technology works and this is why they're collecting our data, it should make us suspicious of them, but they don't deserve our respect as people who have figured out how to do that which everyone from Rasputin to Mesmer to MK Ultra to pickup artists have signally failed to do.
There's a whole lot to respond to there, and I'm going to try to just pick up one or 2 points. I think it has become fashionable in certain circles over the last 10 to 15 years to spend a great deal of time articulating what we don't want from technology. And the reality that we need to recognize, all of us, is that that's just not good enough anymore. We need to put forward a clear affirmative vision for what we do want from technology. So in my case, I'm interested in seeing greater community ownership of digital platforms. I think we should work hard to design mechanisms that will enable that and also enable effective governance of those platforms. Certainly, blockchain is not going to solve all of those problems any more than decentralization is going to solve every problem that could theoretically come up. But I think it's crucial for all of us to recognize that these concepts exist on a continuum. And I know very few people who would argue that on the continuum between centralization and decentralization, we should be going further towards centralization right now. So the question then becomes, how do we come up with a thoughtful, well-reasoned, responsible approach for creating decentralized systems going forward? And that is what I think a lot of us in this space are seeking to do. The second element that I'd highlight as it relates to governance is that the governance models in this ecosystem are very, very nascent. And I, for example, have been working with many members of Congress who are preparing to introduce legislation that will create a legal status for DAOs that will provide a pretty compelling successor to the joint stock corporation, the concept for which has existed since the early 1840s. It's not a bad thing to try to design new solutions that will take advantage of the toolbox we have and move us beyond regulatory structures that date, whether it's to the 1840s in the case of the joint stock corporation or to the Great Depression in the case of the SEC. We have a powerful set of new tools, and from a policy standpoint, it would behoove us to think proactively around how we want to use those tools, rather than simply pointing out a lot of very understandable and in most cases predictable flaws with 1.0 technologies as we try to build the third generation of the internet.
Thank you all. I'm going to go quickly to questions before we run out of time. I think this one would be good for Michelle. It's a question from Marco Vega, who asks, the right to portability of data, Article 20 of the General Data Protection Regulation, could it have special relevance in an SSI model on Web3? Is there a risk in leaving people defenseless in a Web3 model when their human rights are affected?
Great, thanks for that. So I haven't really thought about the interaction of portability and a self-sovereign identity as much, but so essentially, I think that this again, so I think the question is hard to answer to the extent that, most of the SSI models are extremely nascent, and I haven't really seen any that sort of explicitly connect to portability. There's a wonderful group of researchers at the University of Amsterdam, actually, that are doing detailed research on self-sovereign identity in a blockchain context that might have thought more about this. But most of the models I have seen, at least, don't really sort of explicitly make this link to portability as legal rights as it exists in the GDPR and is also now being introduced by the Digital Markets Act. So it's a bit hard to sort of like speculate of what we might be seeing there. I think a general concern, which I assume that Marco is getting at, is this is the fact that most sovereign identity models actually rely on sort of strong degree of centralization, and that maybe portability is a way to sort of decentralize the data by taking it elsewhere. But as far as I'm aware, there's not sort of much work that has been done on that. So yeah.
Thank you. Next question is from Mark Rotenberg, who also put quite a few comments in the Q&A for those interested. I think this is good for Corey. The early cryptographers rightly focused on the, quote, web of trust and broke away from centralized key management infrastructures to establish trust. He says, so respect for the architectural origins. And I think you can build off of the question of, what comes through architecture and what can be governed on top of it.
I mean, I don't know exactly how that's a question, although I agree that is a thing that I respect. I actually have a phone call coming up with Chaum about, ironically, a Web3 thing he's built. So I do think that the problems of public key infrastructure that's centrally maintained have surfaced, and that's kind of what certificate transparency tries to deal with. There's obviously some good lessons to take from the way that a project that originated as a decentralized project ended up so centralized over and over again, and some of the problems that we faced. I think in terms of an affirmative vision for a decentralized internet, it has to have a policy framework as well as a legal framework, or as well as a technological framework, because it's not technology that made it so that everybody who left Facebook for Instagram ended up giving all their data to Facebook anyway. It was the credulousness of competition regulators who believed Facebook when they lied and said that they weren't buying Instagram for anti-competitive reasons and that they wouldn't merge the back ends of Instagram and Facebook. And that it's not the technology that is at fault there. I have been, as Marietje alluded to in my intro, I've been really beating the drum for a system design around interoperability and around different kinds of interoperability, where on the one hand, you might have mandatory standards like those that are contemplated by the Access Act and those that are contemplated by the Digital Markets Act in the EU. Or you might have a softer version of that where you have mandatory requirements, where you say a platform over a certain scale is required to have an API that meets these requirements. And if you adopt the standard, you have a safe harbor. You are presumptively in compliance with that rule, but you can also develop it your own way, which could give some more flexibility. But in addition to that, I would favor creating legal defenses for interoperators who don't use those standardized APIs or those requirements satisfying APIs, which would give us a lot of flexibility and freedom that we see in the history of these tech companies that are such giants today and that resist reverse engineering and scraping and bots and all those other tactics so strenuously today. Where would Apple be today if Microsoft had had the right to stop it from reverse engineering Microsoft Office and producing the iWorks suite? And therefore liberating Windows users from having to use Windows in order to communicate with people who wanted to use Office. And I think that sets up a kind of balance of incentives and an equilibrium that is far more robust than either having a free-for-all where you say anyone can reverse engineer anything, which produces a very precarious situation where you're locked in an arms race with large, well-capitalized adversaries, or saying we require that the largest firms allow for interoperability because it's very easy for them to sabotage that interoperability mandate, to do malicious compliance. And it takes a long time to punish them for doing it. Ideally, what you want is a situation where you tell them they have to allow interoperability. And then if they mess with the world, if they break that interoperability, rather than waiting 15 years for a lawmaker to take notice of it and fine them, immediately the smaller entities, the new market entrants, the cooperatives, the nonprofits, they get to start reverse engineering them. They get to play guerrilla warfare, which produces unquantifiable risk for the dominant firms, which is something that they disfavor much more strongly than they disfavor having to follow the rules. And so ideally it would just stay their hands. In the boardroom, they would say, well, let's break the API. And someone would say, are you kidding? You know how many engineers we're going to have to pay to block bots if you break the API? And then if they went ahead and did it anyway, because there's no underestimating the hubris of large tech companies, well, then we'd have a remedy, right? The new entities who've been fenced out by the blocking of the API could then start using bots and scraping and reverse engineering while they waited for the regulator to catch up with them. And I think that's a vision that produces a world where we have technological self-determination, where we and the toolsmiths that we rely on can produce tools that let us seize the means of computation rather than relying on giants, largesse, or public interest, or the slow-moving and largely captured regulatory process.
Thank you. I have one question for Tomike and then a question for each of you to conclude. This is from an anonymous attendee. Why would most people be interested in participatory or having a stake promise of Web3? If I think of my parents, they probably would prefer decisions taken centrally rather than having them participate in a web community to use the services they want. And maybe you can add on the question that I was left with, which is, what is in it for venture capitalists to delegate decisions to certain communities? How has that worked out? So I guess it's more about the practicalities of these communities. Do people want it? Is it self-selecting? What are the incentives and so on?
Well, excellent question. And let me start at the outset by saying, if you are happy with a single centralized actor making all of your decisions, then Mark Zuckerberg will be delighted to oblige. And we're living in that world right now. So, in some ways, your parents can be very content with what they have to offer at Facebook. Many of us, I think, are not content with that as the status quo. And when we have done public opinion polling, what we have found is that there is a pretty remarkable break around 50 years of age. Our pollsters have said they've never seen such a stark divide on any issue that they have ever polled from a demographic standpoint when it comes to people's feelings about centralization and decentralization. So younger voters, younger users of the internet clearly understand the importance and the value of decentralized platforms and decentralized decision-making. In terms of what's in it for venture capitalists and what's in it for all of us, I think we see two really important dynamics. The first is the vast preponderance of the gains from Web 2 platforms have gone to a very small number of individuals. Certainly some venture capitalists have done very well off of this, but it has not been an economic model that provides broadly based benefits. We see an opportunity to expand the pie, and I think that's important for everybody to recognize. If we do this well, if we get this right, the economic benefits that come from Web3 will be vastly larger and much more broadly distributed than the economic benefits that emerged from Web 2. Certainly, if we're putting money into projects, we see an opportunity there. But it's fascinating and important to note that many of the most talented founders that we work with have told us they will not allow any entity to control more than 1% of their platform. And so if we want to go beyond that in terms of an ownership stake, then we need to delegate our governance rights to nonprofit organizations, universities, and other civil society actors. So we're seeing a very healthy, in my mind, feedback loop start to emerge that is creating decentralization, even in a world where you need a great deal of capital to build successful projects. And I think if I were to critique anything that Corey said, I'm a big fan of his views on interoperability. I think it is important to recognize it is not inexpensive to build these systems. They take a lot of extremely high quality talent to get it right. So in a world where you need access to capital in order to build systems, let's start thinking about mechanisms like interoperability, as Corey suggested very wisely, like governance, that will ensure that the outcomes mirror what we would like to see from society. And for those like the questioner's parents who are content having a centralized model, you can kick back. You've got that already. You're in good shape.
Thank you. I know we're running out of time, and I'm actually sad about it because I think this was one of the better sessions that I've been a part of at the Cyber Policy Center at Stanford. But just to focus us back on the question of this this seminar's theme, which is policy implications. Imagine you are a democratically elected, but nevertheless all-powerful policymaker, and you have to make one decision about Web3 right now. What would it be?
Right, I go first again. I think it'd be education, right? Just generally of myself and the people that work for me or with me. I, spoken to quite a few policymakers over the past years about this, and some of them are like incredibly knowledgeable about the topic. But I've also gotten to see that sometimes there's no sort of built-in path for people working in some of those decision-making centers to sort of keep up with technological developments, both in relation to Web3 and beyond. So I think that would be the starting point, because really I think everything flows from that.
Gosh, it's hard to do just one. I mean, I think that subjecting wash trading to the rules related to related party transactions in securities regulation would deflate an enormous amount of scams, assuming you could actually administer such a rule, and probably, as Vitalik said today, get a lot of the crap out of the system.
Thank
And
you.
I'm going to conclude with a big one. Every open society, every democratic government should immediately launch a national strategy to develop a multi-stakeholder values-based approach for building out these technologies. Again, this is something that's going to take time. It's a generational project. We're going to have to work on it together, but it's not going to happen accidentally. We need to be thoughtful. We need to be deliberate. We need to be responsible in how we pursue this. And we have a much better shot at getting it right if we actually set out with the goal of getting it right, rather than just sleepwalking into Web 2, which is what happened the last time around.
Thank you, especially to the three of you, Michelle, Corey, Tamika, and our team behind the scenes, another Michelle, Haifa, Seb, and thank you all for joining. This was great. I wish you a good rest of your day.